people will continue to come in. And hello, everyone. It has been months since we have seen many of you. My name is Dr. Betty Tonsing. I am on the board of the Indiana Council of World Affairs. I'm Vice President of Programs, and we've had a great time preparing for our 2022-2023 launch for the Indiana Council of World Affairs program year for 2 programs. This evening, of course, distinguished speakers, and then coming up in early 2023 will be great decisions. And we are so excited. We have a fabulous lineup of programs, and we just can't wait to present them all to you. And this evening is going to be particularly poignant because we're going to be looking forward by basically looking back. 1 year ago, it was all things Afghanistan, and it was a very powerful and a very poignant time. For many people who were part of a lifeline, we helped people get out of Afghanistan. Everyone was riveted by the news that was going on, and we wanted to take a look back to see where is Afghanistan today. We will be doing that. A little bit about our program year. I have several of my students in this evening, and I am thrilled that you're on. I'm not taking attendance. I won't have time to do that, but I'm glad you're on. And this basically is going to cover our chapter on foreign affairs and all things global matters. I say that because I want to encourage many of the people who come. You are academics. And we want to remind you that high school students and university students are free. They can become a member of the Indiana Council of World Affairs for free. If you're a student, you can become a member for free, and that entitles you to many free benefits of membership that we have, including, I believe, the daily chatter and a weekly quiz, which is really great. It's going to, for those particularly students who are very interested in or majoring in international affairs, if you read the daily chatter and you took the weekly quiz, you are going to be on top of it and be well informed. And it's really great. It'll help you really sharpen that global saw. So you can learn more about that if you are a student or if you are an academic and you want to tell your students about it. Just please go to our website, indianaworld.org. And if you want to know more about how you can get your students registered, our email is very simple, info@indianaworld.org. I'd like to do something a little bit different this year. We come on and their various members of the board play a role. We are a working board for this organization that's been around for 70 years. The Indiana Council of World Affairs in Indiana for 70 years. We have changed quite a bit over the 70 years. We also have a very active high school student program. So we're not just old seniors sitting around talking about affairs. We are a very diverse group of people across the spectrum and becoming even more diverse. Our roots do go back, however, for 100 years. And there's been a lot of change in the types of issues that we look at that are urgent matter. I would like for you to know a little bit about who is on that board. Mary is our technical host. She's our intern for the year. She's the woman who lets you in and is extraordinarily helpful to us. She is a marketing major at Ball State University. This evening will be closed by Dr. Ray Montagna. Ray is our new president of the board of directors for Indiana Council of World Affairs. You probably see on the first page with me, Larry Cimino. Many of you saw his very friendly face welcoming you to distinguished speakers. He was our president for a number of years, and he did an awful lot to really take this council to the next level. He did a tremendous amount that got us very excited, the entire board, that we want to really continue this. He's going to be going back to his own global work now. He is a retired senior executive with Lilly. He was the president of the Lilly Foundation, and he's currently deeply involved with a foundation, a global program based in Geneva that's dealing with co-occurring medical issues, dealing with mental health, and I believe diabetes. And he's going to be going back to that work. It's going to take him out and pull him away with a lot of time. Ray Montagna is our new board president. I hope he tells a little bit more about himself. We're very excited to have Ray. He's been with us for some time, and we're going to make sure he's very busy. Ray is he's a recovering professor. I asked, are you retired? No, I'm recovering professor from Ball State University, where he was a professor in the international business group, and he also was in charge of a lot of study abroad programs, had a Fulbright in Germany, and got bit with the international bug that kept him deeply engaged in that. Let's see, what else would like for you to know before I introduce you to Larry, because we want to go swiftly into our program. We want to make sure that we give our speaker all the time he needs. He's got a very good program lined up. And as always, our program is going to end with 45 minutes of a robust Q&A. So please take notes. Ken has lined up some interviews. He's got a very important topic to talk about tonight. The world's attention has been focused on Ukraine, but we cannot forget Afghanistan. This is crucial also. It's an urgent matter. There was a very active civil society, and now, of course, we do not have that. And so we want to know what's going on, but write down your questions, a very robust Q&A. And with that, I am going to introduce you to Larry Cimino.
Thank you, Betty. And it's great to be with all of you again to start this new season. I think we're picking up right where we left off in selecting timely, relevant, important topics for our distinguished speaker programs. And though Dr. Ray Montagno has succeeded me in the role as president, I remain active on the program committee, and I'm still committed to bringing you great programs and excellent speakers. Dr. Kenneth Holland is President Emeritus of the American University of Afghanistan in Kabul, having served as the university's president for several years. Dr. Holland specializes in establishing the rule of law in developing countries and the legal foundations of the global trading system. He was a senior civilian advisor to the Commander of NATO forces on building the rule of law in Afghanistan. And previously, he managed multiple development projects there for the World Bank, for USAID, and the Department of State for over 10 years. He's also served on the board of our Indiana Council on World Affairs, so it's delightful to welcome him home, at least virtually. Dr. Holland is currently a professor of law and dean of O.P. Jindal Global University in India, where he is now, and it's about 4 o'clock in the morning there. So thank you, Ken, for staying up for us, or getting up for us. Dr. Holland remains in touch with faculty and alumni from the American University of Afghanistan, those in exile in various countries around the world, as well as many who remain in the country today. So he's uniquely qualified to understand what's happened there over the past year since the withdrawal of US troops. So after Dr. Holland's presentation, he'll take questions, and you can use the chat button at the bottom of your screen to send questions to me. So look for, under chat, look for Larry Cimino, starts with a C, which I will collect and present to him. So please address the question to me rather than to the group at large. Or let me know that you have a question that you would like to ask yourself. And you can open your microphone then, and not before then, please, when called upon to ask your question.
You're sitting in his living room.
So
This is library.
okay, please mute your microphones now, because it's my pleasure to welcome our first distinguished speaker of 2022 and 2023 season, Dr. Kenneth Holland. And I recommend you use the speaker view so that you can see him without seeing the whole.
He's no longer a president.
So thank you very much. And
Tanya's not president.
Mary, can you mute everybody, please?
Yeah.
Betty, she's a pain.
Barry Reed, you're not muted.
You're not muted, Barry.
Yeah.
Mary, can you mute everybody, please? Is that possible?
Okay.
Hi,
so
Betty. Yeah, sorry, I forgot I was muted. I'm doing that right now.
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay. And go to speaker view now so that you can see Dr. Holland. Ken, you there?
Yeah, thanks, Larry. It's great to be back with the Indiana Council on World Affairs. And thank you for this opportunity to look at what's happened in Afghanistan over the past year. So I have a PowerPoint presentation, and so let me go ahead and share my screen. And I have a couple of videos I'll be playing during my presentation, and you can actually adjust the volume on your own device, your laptop or PC or your phone. So want to make sure everybody can hear our two speakers. So we're going to look at the consequences of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. As we all know, August 30th marked the 1-year anniversary of the last US troops leaving Afghanistan. And as Larry mentioned, my wife Julie and I had been managing development projects in Afghanistan for 13 years, from 2006 until 2019. So obviously we had a great deal invested emotionally as well as professionally in that country. And we continue to help as many of our former colleagues and students as possible. So the end of America's longest military intervention, sometimes called America's longest war, of course, it was overshadowed by the Taliban's takeover of Kabul on the 15th of August. And of course, a very tumultuous evacuation of 80,000 Afghan citizens from the Kabul airport. I think all of us were glued to our TV screens as we watched desperate Afghans clinging onto US military aircraft taking off from the Kabul airport. I think we all have to admit that the US mission was a failure. We did not achieve really any of our goals. We tried to build a functioning, healthy, liberal democracy. That did not happen. Afghanistan is now one of the most autocratic, authoritarian regimes in the world. When you look at who spoke at the UN General Assembly last week, two countries were not invited to speak, and that was Afghanistan and Myanmar. So women's rights have been rolled back, as we all know. Girls are not allowed to go to secondary school, for example. And sadly, I think for all of us, Afghanistan is now again a haven for international terrorists. So in terms of the three goals we set for ourselves, we did not achieve any of them. Here's a map of Afghanistan, and we're going to be, I'm going to be playing a clip of an interview that I conducted recently with one of my former students at the American University of Afghanistan, Masuma Tajik. And Masuma is a computer science major, and she was with her family in Herat in the west of the country when the Taliban began taking over the country. So in July, when she saw that the Taliban were approaching Herat, she actually hired a car and a driver to take her from Herat to Kabul, where she could catch an evacuation flight. So she actually traveled all across the width of Afghanistan to get to Kabul. Here's her odyssey. I made a table, and I think this will help you as you listen to her interview. So as I said, in July of 2021, she hired a car and a driver to take her to Kabul, a very dangerous journey. In Kabul, she was evacuated to Kyiv, Ukraine by the Wall Street Journal. She was also a freelance writer for the Wall Street Journal, and so they evacuated her. At the same time, I was able to secure a scholarship for Masuma at Rutgers University, working with the Institute for International Education in New York City. And so she was admitted to Rutgers University. But when she went to the US Embassy in Kyiv, she was denied a student visa. So she looked like she was going to be remain in Ukraine for the indefinite future. Of course, the invasion of Ukraine took place in February 2022. The Rutgers University advised her to flee Kyiv and move to Lviv, which is on the border with Poland. And then she was in Lviv. And then a Polish volunteer actually picked her up in Lviv and drove her to the Polish border and arranged for her to enter Poland. So she's very, very grateful to this Polish volunteer. So she entered Poland as a refugee. And when she went to the US Embassy in Warsaw for her student visa interview, she was denied again. So now it looked like she didn't have any path forward to get to the United States. So she left Warsaw, went to Berlin, Germany. As you know, Poland was overrun with Ukrainian refugees. So she moved to Berlin. And then from Berlin, she moved to the Netherlands, and she did a very intelligent thing. She applied for asylum in the Netherlands. And as you'll see, this actually becomes very important to her because she now has legal status. She did not have legal status in Ukraine or in Poland, but now she has legal status as an asylum applicant in the Netherlands. She gets her passport back from the Netherlands police in June of 2022. Then she goes to the US Embassy and in the Netherlands. And this time she is granted her visa, the third time. And the reason she was granted her visa is because she was not considered a refugee from Afghanistan, but a refugee from Ukraine. And there were special provisions for granting visas to Ukrainian refugees. So in August this year, she began her studies at Rutgers University. So quite an odyssey. So here's a map. You can kind of see her odyssey from Ukraine to Poland to Germany and then to the Netherlands and then to New Brunswick, New Jersey. So I'm just going to play about 8 minutes of my interview with Masuma, and I think you'll find her a very engaging young woman. Okay, Masuma, I'm so happy to meet with you a year later and to see that you've left Afghanistan and you're now in America. And I know that you've been through many challenges and you've had many adventures. So I wonder if you could just tell us about your story. You know, what have you been doing since August of last year?
All right. Thank you so much. I am really pleased to be here today and speak to you after 1 year. I remember it was exactly one year ago when I was in Kiev. And also thank you so much for creating this platform for us to speak. And yes, I am in the US right now at Rutgers University in New Jersey, New Brunswick, and I'm doing my master's in public informatics. It's my first semester, and I'm really excited about all the new adventures that I will have ahead of me. And this past year, not only for me, but for all Afghans, especially Afghan diaspora, was a really challenging year, and they had to overcome so many challenges and difficulties that they weren't ready for. Especially myself, last year in August when I fled Kabul, I went to Kiev in search of safety and peace, and I lived there for 7 months. And unfortunately, another war happened that I wasn't expecting that. And getting out of Ukraine was another challenge that I had to overcome. And the nature of war in Ukraine was slightly different from Kabul because the invasion was really severe and so many casualties and also military attacks were happening. And at that time I was very lucky that I got informed beforehand that I needed to move from Kiev to a safer city. And in my case, I left Kiev 2 weeks before the invasion, and I went to Lviv, which shares border with Poland. And at that time, when I was still in Kiev, I was applying for universities in the US and also in neighboring countries like UK and also Germany, because I really could not give up on my education. And although Ukraine is a really nice country, but I really didn't see any educational opportunity and career opportunity for me there. So I was trying my best to apply for universities and also for jobs outside of Ukraine. And the other challenge that I had was that my passport was getting expired, and unfortunately, the Afghan embassy in Kiev wasn't really cooperative because of the situations in Kabul and because of lack of resources. But fortunately, a few weeks before the invasion, I managed to get a stamp on my passport and renew my passport. But the other challenge that I faced was that so I got admission from different universities, one of them in the UK, but then again, because of the passport situation and the visa problem, as so many Afghan students have faced problems regarding getting visas because of the fact that they cannot demonstrate their intention of going back to their home country, which in our case, we didn't have a home country to go back to. And I got rejected for visa to the UK as well as the US for the first time. But then at that time, I had my acceptance from Rutgers University, but I had to move to Lviv because of the safety reasons, and I stayed there for 2 weeks. I remember that on 23rd of February, I celebrated my birthday alone. It was a very nice day. It was a very peaceful day. Lviv is such a beautiful city. But the next morning, I woke up with the sound of sirens and so many texts from my friends and from my colleagues, and also from Rutgers University, advising me to move to Poland or to a neighboring country. And at that time, I didn't have legal status in Ukraine, and at the same time, I didn't have a visa to a neighboring country to move to. So I felt stuck, and I felt trapped. And on 24th, I packed my backpack, the same backpack that I brought from Kabul, and I took a few stuff in my bag, and then I moved to a church. I took shelter in a church for 3 days, and many people from other cities, especially from eastern cities in Ukraine, were moving to Lviv and western cities to take shelter, and they were mostly taking shelter in metro subways and churches and also in universities. So I went to the church and I took shelter there for 3 days, and it was not a very pleasant situation. Like foods were barely available on the shelves in supermarkets, and I remember that at that time I wanted to cash out money from Western Union, but there was no cash available in the bank. And for a fact, I knew that if I don't get killed by Russians, I will die from hunger because of lack of cash and also food crisis. But fortunately, on 26th, I managed to connect with a Polish volunteer. I was really impressed by the generosity of Polish people. And so volunteers from Poland were driving and coming to Lviv and picking up Ukrainians and taking them to the border. And At that time, I really wish that in Afghanistan we also had such generous neighbors to help us. And at that time, like until I hadn't found a car, I was determined to walk to the border because so many people were doing that because of the.
So you can see that Masuma was a very determined young lady, and she at one point in the church in Lviv thought that she might either be killed by Russians or starve to death, but a Polish volunteer rescued her and took her across the border from Ukraine into Poland. She mentioned something very important. She said she wished Afghanistan had neighbors like Ukraine has. And so that's a very striking observation on her part. So one of the things we need to do when we think about Afghanistan is look at the neighboring countries and ask ourselves, are they interested in helping the Afghan people? So let's just kind of review the key developments of the past year. So one of the most important was a drone strike launched by the United States that killed the leader of Al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, in Kabul on July 31st. He was actually living in a very posh house in a very upscale neighborhood of Kabul. He obviously was the guest of the Taliban regime. We also see that the Taliban do not seem at all committed to the terms of the agreement that they signed with the United States in Doha on February 29th, 2021. I'm here in India, and India is very concerned about the threat that Al-Qaeda poses to India. And of course, Al-Qaeda is now being sheltered in Afghanistan. I just returned from a trip to Pakistan, and there met with some think tanks in Pakistan, and they told me they're very, very concerned about Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, which is the terrorist group that is trying to overthrow the Pakistani state, and also called the TTP, and they also have haven in Afghanistan. And then we also know that the Islamic State Khorasan province, ISIS-K, is operating within Afghanistan, and it actually is trying to overthrow the Taliban. So there's a lot of armed conflict taking place, both within Afghanistan and in neighboring countries. With regard to women's rights and human rights, this is a great tragedy. I'm very, very happy that I was able to help Masuma escape Afghanistan, but many of her relatives and friends, of course, are still in the country. We saw that in March 2022, the Taliban reversed their commitment to allow girls to attend secondary school. It's the only country in the world that doesn't allow girls to go to high school. We also saw that women and girls have lost their rights not only to education, but also to employment, access to justice, and free movement. My wife, Julie, and I have also been helping female judges leave Afghanistan. So they are obviously targets for Taliban retaliation. The Ministry of Women's Affairs and the Independent Human Rights Commission were abolished by the Taliban. The Ministry of Women's Affairs became the Ministry to Promote Virtue and Suppress Vice. Child marriage and forced marriage are on the increase. You probably have read stories about Afghan families selling their children for money. There's been an increase in social and domestic violence against women in Afghanistan. The Taliban are enforcing patriarchal norms. It's often said that the Taliban is not an Islamic regime, it's really a patriarchal regime. And atrocities are also being committed against minorities, especially Hazara and Shia groups in Afghanistan. So the record of human rights and women's rights is appalling with regard to the Taliban. There are many Muslim countries, as we know, and none of them, not one of them, treats women the way the Taliban do. Islamic scholars say there's no basis in Sharia law for the way in which the Taliban treat women. And we know that under the Afghan Republic, which was in place for 20 years, that Afghans supported education for girls. One of my goals as president of the American University of Afghanistan was that at least half of the students at the university be female, and I was able to accomplish that. So obviously, most Afghans during that 20-year period where the US was heavily involved in building a modern society in Afghanistan, there was strong support among the population, not only for female education, but also employment for women and free movement of women. As we know, there's a dire humanitarian and economic situation in Afghanistan. There's a lack of food and medical care. Afghanistan lost in one day 40% of its gross domestic product when the US stopped providing aid on the 15th of August. Now, the majority of Afghans live below subsistence level. The coming winter will be a crisis point. There'll be a tremendous amount of suffering throughout the country. Mass out-migration may be the only alternative for many Afghans to mass death. So again, many countries that used to welcome Afghan refugees no longer do so. Pakistan is the best example. There's little international interest in investing in Afghanistan since the country is extremely unstable. The Taliban approach to governance is quite interesting from a political science point of view. The first thing you see is that no country has recognized the Taliban de facto government. The Taliban have resisted international calls for forming an inclusive government. As you know, most of the Taliban are Pashtun, but Pashtuns only make up about 40% of the population. So the other ethnic minorities, the other tribes have been excluded from the government. The Taliban have not written the new constitution. They say they're simply enforcing Sharia law. The leader of the Emirate, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, as it's now called by them, the Emir, he has asserted his authority. He vetoes decisions of the cabinet. So it's really a one-man autocracy. The Taliban assert their legitimacy to rule Afghanistan and will not tolerate any challenges. When they're asked, why don't you include other groups within the government, they say, why should we? We have all the power. That's their attitude. So it is now one of the most authoritarian regimes in the world. When they're asked about their plans for governing the country, they say, oh, we're on jihad. The UN can feed the people. We don't have to worry about that. Is Afghanistan a threat to its neighbors? And the answer is yes. It's an ironic situation because most of Afghanistan's neighboring countries welcomed the US withdrawal. China, Russia were very happy for the US forces to leave the country. The Chinese especially have engaged the Taliban several months before their takeover. They had invited the Taliban leaders to Beijing and other cities in China. But as I found out in my recent visit to Pakistan, the Taliban have disappointed their neighbors. Russia and China have not recognized the Taliban. The Taliban do not recognize the border with Pakistan. Whenever the Pakistani government tries to erect a fence on its border with Afghanistan, Taliban fighters tear down the fence. And when I was in Pakistan, there was actually shooting between the Taliban fighters and the Pakistani army, and there were many, many casualties. So it's a very unstable situation on the border. The Taliban also support the greatest terrorist threat to Pakistan, the TTP, and provide them safe haven. And the Taliban pointed out that Pakistan actually allowed the United States to use its airspace to launch the drone that killed al-Zawahiri. So Pakistan is not pleased at all with the behavior of the Taliban. The Chinese want to invest. They want to extend the Belt and Road Initiative, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor to Afghanistan, but they can't because the country is so unstable and there's so much violence. The Russians are very disappointed that the Taliban have refused to include groups close to Russia, the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, the Turkmens in the government. Iran and Russia are both concerned about the threat to their regime from ISIS, Khorasan. And India, of course, is very concerned about terrorists who are trained in Afghanistan, crossing the border and going to Jammu in Kashmir and engaging in terrorist acts against India there. Many of you probably have questions about why the United States has been holding on to the reserves of the Central Bank of Afghanistan, about $7 billion. In February, President Biden announced that he would split the money. $3.5 billion would be allocated to help the Afghan people, and then the other $3.5 billion would be earmarked to compensate the relatives of the victims of the 9/11 attack, which of course was planned by Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Recently, a new fund called the Afghan Fund, based in Geneva, has been established to supervise the spending of the $3.5 billion earmarked for the Afghan people. The United States does not trust the Taliban, and so this new fund in Geneva will actually perform the functions of the Central Bank of Afghanistan, such as paying Afghanistan's international arrears, its electricity imports, and future necessities such as printing currency. So those functions, which would normally be performed by the Afghan Central Bank, will actually be performed by this new Afghan fund based in Geneva. Now, the United States obviously has to make a decision about whether to isolate the Taliban, actively oppose the Taliban, or engage with the Taliban. It could treat the Taliban the way it treats Cuba, North Korea, Iran, Venezuela. The Biden administration has attempted to engage the Taliban. In the most obvious way is in the supply of humanitarian assistance. The US has contributed much more than any other country, over $800 million so far. And the money goes into international agencies and aid groups, but is never given to the Taliban itself. So there's a kind of a parallel government in Afghanistan, one basically run by the United Nations and by international aid groups with funding from Western countries. It operates completely independently or separately from the Taliban de facto government. So the number of questions we have to ask ourselves, does the United States have a moral obligation to the Afghan people, 40 million people? Should the US reopen its embassy in Kabul? The Indian government has reopened its embassy in Kabul, for example. And is there a viable resistance to the Taliban? Is there some hope that the Afghan people will rise up and overthrow the Taliban government? And so to help answer that question, I have a clip from an interview conducted recently with Mr. Ali Nazari, who I know well personally. And he is the Minister of Foreign Affairs for the National Resistance Front, which is the main opposition group to the Taliban. So I'll just play a few minutes of this clip, which you can find on YouTube.
With my good friend Greg, and The situation in Afghanistan right now is very dire. The country since August 15 has been experiencing different types of crises. We have a humanitarian crisis, which is the worst humanitarian crisis that Afghanistan has experienced in its recent history. We have a political crisis. The country is in a state of anarchy at the moment. There is no law and order, there is no government to represent Afghanistan. And third is a security crisis. Afghanistan's borders are not being controlled. There is an influx of terrorist groups coming into Afghanistan, and the country risks in becoming once again a sanctuary for international terrorism. Going into the humanitarian crisis, unfortunately, there's a lot of misconceptions, misunderstanding when it comes to the current situation with the humanitarian situation, with the starvation that the people of Afghanistan are experiencing. Many in the international community believe that, well, it's a lack of assistance, a lack of cooperation in Afghanistan, that starvation has happened, it has increased throughout the country. However, what we believe is that the reason why there is a humanitarian crisis today is because a terrorist group, a crime syndicate, has come into power, has hijacked the whole country, and is starving the population. A group or a combination of different groups under the umbrella name of the Taliban. There's different factions, there are different groups with different goals and aims, and they have, some are drug cartels and drug kingpins, some are terrorist groups with a radical Islamist ideology, with a jihadist ideology. Some joined the Taliban umbrella group because of they felt marginalized in the previous government. So there is different factions that are fighting over power at the moment, and this is why there is a state of anarchy. And they don't have the intention and will to bring law and order into the country, to build state institutions, to serve the people, and to address the economic and the humanitarian situation at the moment. Their so-called prime minister said that our duty was jihad. It's not to feed the people. It's God's duty to feed the people, and so people should pray to God. That's their mentality. And so what we believe is, as long as there is a terrorist group, as long as there is a group like the Taliban in power, Afghanistan will continue having a humanitarian crisis. And the political crisis as well, which is the country lacks any state institutions, lacks a government, a bureaucracy at the moment, which in turn has created the security crisis, which is allowing different groups, criminal groups, to operate throughout the country. It's allowing international terrorists to come into the country right now. And there is an influx of foreign fighters from the Middle East, from North Africa, from Central Asia, South Asia. Around 13,000 foreign fighters have come into Afghanistan. They're building bases, they're building training camps, and they're affiliated with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So this is the situation that we're facing today, and unfortunately, it's not something that we expected.
So, and what's your vision of Afghanistan? What Commander Massoud thinks that should be done in order to improve things there?
Well, the reason why Ahmad Massoud, the leader of the National Resistance Front, stayed in the country while the president left and the whole political elite left and went into exile was because he believed that the people of Afghanistan will not accept a terrorist group as their representatives, and this is what has happened. And he believes that the people in Afghanistan, they support democracy, and the vision that the National Resistance Front has for Afghanistan's future, is to reestablish democracy, to free the people from the suppression that they're experiencing today, to gain Afghanistan's independence, because Afghanistan has lost its independence. It's in reality a country, a protectorate of Pakistan at the moment, because the Taliban is a proxy of Pakistan. They are being funded and supported by Pakistan. And we believe that, yes, there was a democracy in the past 20 years, but it was a flawed democracy. We need a democracy based on our own traditions, based on Afghanistan's realities. To establish social justice, Afghanistan is one of the rarest countries in the world. It's a country made up of ethnic minorities. It's a heterogeneous country. It lacks a majority. So no ethnic group constitutes a majority, and it's because of the arbitrary boundaries that were drawn up by the British Empire and the Russian Empire in the 19th century. So in a country like Afghanistan, you cannot have power concentrated in one city and in one individual. We saw what happened to the democracy of the past 20 years. Power was concentrated in Kabul and in the hands of one individual, which was the president. As soon as the president left, he fled the country, we saw everything collapse like a house of cards. And people felt that they weren't part of decision-making and policy-making. This is very important in a democracy. For a strong democracy, for a functioning democracy, you have to establish social justice. People from all over the country, from all ethnic groups, from all sectarian groups, from both men and women, from all religions, they have to perceive themselves in power. So we believe that a reformed democracy with a better power sharing deal is the right vision for Afghanistan's future. And the people of Afghanistan support this. The people of Afghanistan are adamantly and vehemently against the Taliban, and they support our efforts at the moment.
So you can see that there is an organized resistance to the Taliban, the National Resistance Front. So what are the prospects for the future? Well, in terms of Afghans trying to come to the United States, there are about 70,000 applicants for the Special Immigration Visa, or SIV as it's called, including family members of Afghans who worked closely with the US government. They still remain in Afghanistan. I'm in touch with many of them every day, trying to help them maneuver through this SIV process. Unfortunately, only about 40% of them will end up receiving the SIV. And for the others, unfortunately, there are very limited paths for them to come to the United States. The 70,000 or 80,000 who were evacuated last August of 2021, most of them came on humanitarian parole, and they're now in the process of applying for asylum in the United States. But humanitarian parole is not being granted to applicants now who are still in Afghanistan. The US State Department also has something called the Priority 1 and Priority 2 visa programs for Afghans, but I still haven't heard of anyone receiving the P1 or P2 visa. One of the requirements of applying for the P1 or P2 visa is that the applicant has to be in a third country. So some of the AUAF students who are now in Iraq, at American University in Sulaymaniyah, Iraq, they have, some of them have even received, I think, a P2 interview at the US consulate in Kurdistan, but none of them, as far as I know, has yet been granted the P1 or P2 visa. The United States will continue to provide humanitarian assistance to the people of Afghanistan. It's now estimated that 95% of the people of Afghanistan either are now or soon will be below the poverty line. So it is becoming the very poorest country in the world. Americans can help the Afghan people by donating to the United Nations World Food Program. That's the major supplier of food to the Afghan people. And the US is the major provider of funding. But as we saw, at least at the present time, no country, not even Pakistan, shows interest in granting diplomatic recognition to the Taliban de facto government. So if you're interested in donating to the United Nations World Food Program, here's the website that you could go to, and there's a button you can click that will allow you to make a donation. So it's, again, if you want to help feed the starving people of Afghanistan, this is one way to do that. All right, so I'm really very much looking forward to your comments and your questions, and I'll turn over the microphone to Larry Cimino.
Yeah, well, thanks, Ken. That was great. And there are a few questions coming in. And please, if you have additional questions, go to the chat button at the bottom there and send them to me. And either let me know if you would like me to read the question, or if you would like to ask the question yourself, you'd be welcome to. One of your other students sent a note in, was happy to see you. Syed Zabiullah Sadat, former undergrad student at American University of Afghanistan. And he is in University of Missouri in Columbia right now, and is in school there. He says he's going to join the Indiana Council on World Affairs, and he thanks you and others for speaking up about what's going on there. One of our board members, Dr. Pierre Atlas, has a question. I want Pierre to unmute his microphone and ask the question himself. Pierre?
Hi, I'm trying to get my camera on, but I can't. Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Terrific presentation, Ken. I really I learned a lot. I really appreciated it. I really enjoyed the interview with Masuma, and as a Rutgers alum myself, got my PhD in political science there. I was really glad to see that she finally made it to New Brunswick, and I wish her the best of luck. She'll get a great education there. Your entire focus was kind of like forward-looking, which I think was really important because not enough people are looking at what comes next. But my question is really about the past. Given your experience, the amount of years you spent in Afghanistan, your advisory capacity, your educational role there, do you think it was inevitable that this mission, the American mission, would fail in Afghanistan? Do you think maybe things could have been done differently from the very beginning? I mean, this is over 4 administrations. Should we have gone in more as a counterterrorism mission as opposed to nation building? Did Bush take his eye off the ball with Iraq? Did Obama maybe pull too many troops out? Did Trump make a mistake in negotiating with the Taliban? What could Biden have done differently in terms of getting out? Over this 20-year period, just what do you think the U.S. might have done differently? And while you were on the ground there at the University of Afghanistan, were there things that you were seeing that maybe we could have been doing differently at the time that you were seeing in real time? And I'll mute, and I'm looking forward to hear what you have to say.
Sure, Pierre, those are great questions. As you know, I was obviously on the ground for 13 years because of my duties with NATO, building rule of law throughout the country. I actually worked in 17 of the country's 34 provinces. So I have a point of view that I think most Americans who worked in that country did not have. Many of them, were it's called the Kabul. They lived and worked primarily in Kabul, so they had a very urban experience. Where I was out in the countryside, in the provinces and the districts. I even worked in a project called Government in a Box. So we tried to put Afghan government officials in 100 districts where there was no Afghan government presence. Very much I was trying to bring some kind of democracy to all of Afghanistan. So in terms of mistakes that the U.S. made, I think the first one was made by President Bush because, as you know, the initial mission was completely a counterterrorism mission, and that was to degrade al-Qaeda and prevent Afghanistan from being a base from which terrorist attacks against the United States could be launched. But very soon, in after the US intervention in October of 2001, President Bush gave a speech, I think it was in March 2002, and he says, we can do in Afghanistan what we did in Europe after World War II. So he said, we can have a Marshall Plan for Afghanistan. So he launched the US on a nation building mission. But then, as you pointed out, Pierre, once he decided in 2003 to invade Iraq, that completely dismantled or derailed the nation building enterprise, because most of the money that was earmarked for building civil society and democracy and a market economy in Afghanistan was shifted to fund the war and the occupation of Iraq. So that was a major blow to nation building. I was part of the Obama surge in so it was February 2009. I got the call to join the surge and build rule of law. Before that, I was working in higher education projects. But again, Obama in his second term started withdrawing US forces. And I was again part of that whole withdrawal. I actually negotiated the handover of Taliban prisoners of war from US custody to the Afghan government. So I was deeply involved in the transfer of security responsibilities from the United States to the Afghan government. And I knew at that time it wasn't going to work. But in the end, I think it really comes down to President Trump's decision to negotiate an exit agreement with the Taliban and to exclude the Afghan government from those negotiations. And then President Biden's decision to go ahead and implement the agreement with the Taliban and withdraw all US forces. From my point of view, if President Biden had kept 2,500 American troops in the country, that we wouldn't be dealing with the horrible conditions that the Afghan people are suffering now.
Good. I see that Dr. Betty Tonsing has a question she'd like to ask. Betty?
Thank you, Larry. Ken, I wondered if you can address this. I remember we did the panels last year, and perhaps many in our audience tonight were there. I remember a couple of the panelists saying that it's going to be different at this time with the Taliban because we've had 20 years of particularly women, but a lot of young professionals that you and I had as students working in civil society and diplomatic corps, security, and women were doing all levels of activity and with very few restrictions. And now that was taken from them. And they said, you know, it would be different because now we know what living in a liberal society can be, not liberal like we would describe it, but where we have these freedoms of a civil society. And I wonder if the women are watching, if the Afghan women are looking at what's happening in Iran, where the women there could not have been born before 1979, have known nothing but a authoritarian theocracy. And yet they're being extraordinarily brave with their reaction to the government right now. Do the Afghan women, do you know, have a sense, have you had a sense from anyone that they're looking at this thinking, can't we do that in Afghanistan? I mean, what, can't we just shove these Taliban aside? Or there'll be a tremendous risk, of course, but if the Iranian women are doing this, what are we doing? What, can you expand on that a bit? Perhaps sure. If you had a chance to talk with someone about that, and are the senses still there? It's been a year, but they had 20 years of this sense of knowing living differently. Are these types of protests we're seeing in Iran, could they be possible in Afghanistan with the women?
Well, Betty, there are Afghan women who have protested. You can again go on YouTube and watch videos of Afghan women who had good jobs under the previous government, who had benefits of U.S. training, U.S. education, and they did take to the streets and they did protest, but they were brutally suppressed by the Taliban. So Many of them were arrested, have never been seen since. So they have disappeared. There are some Afghan women who are quietly protesting. For example, they are offering schools inside their own homes. So they're taking, again, a great risk by educating young Afghan girls, especially high school age girls, in their own homes. So there are these kind of secret schools taking place. So the Afghan women I know either are trying to protest in some quiet way, such as offering education illegally to girls, but most of them are trying to leave the country, Betty. They realize there's no future for them in Afghanistan, and they're desperately trying to leave.
Good. I was just thinking about the classical Greek play by one of the comedies by Aristophanes. I don't know if those are familiar with Lysistrata, where the Greek women decided they were tired of war between Sparta and Athens all the time. So they decided that they would boycott relations with men until they stopped fighting this war. So it's a great Greek play if you're interested in such a thing. Okay, we've got some good questions coming in. Sorry for the parenthetical comment there. Angie Kitashoji asks, for Afghan refugees who already came to the US when the government fell, what's the US doing to help them obtain legal status in the US?
Yeah, that's a good question. My wife, Julie, is heavily involved with the Afghan refugees in Muncie, Indiana. So those who came on humanitarian parole, the next step for them is to apply for asylum. They have 2 years from their entry. Most of them entered the United States in either August or September of 2021. So they're now in that second year. So they have 2 years in which to apply for asylum. The Muncie Afghanistan Refugee Committee is providing legal assistance to those Afghans in Muncie. And other refugee groups such as Exodus and Catholic Charities in Indianapolis, Fort Wayne, they're also providing legal assistance to the Afghan parolees. So they have to apply for asylum. The US Congress has allowed an expedited process. So there's a hope that within a few months after applying for asylum, they'll be granted asylum. If they're denied asylum by an asylum officer, then they're allowed to appeal that denial to an immigration judge. So one of the nice things about this asylum application process is that they can continue to work and go to school even while they're going through that process. Once they're granted asylum, then they're allowed to bring their family members, their immediate family members from Afghanistan to join them in the United States. So this will be a great, wonderful moment for all of them. And then as asylees, they're allowed to apply for permanent residency and then for citizenship. So they're all on that path. Those who receive the special immigrant visa, the SIV, they're allowed to bring their family members with them when they enter the United States. So they don't have to worry about that family unification process later. So they're, as SIV holders, they're already on the path to a green card. The green card is issued almost immediately, permanent residency. So the SIV is the best visa for these Afghan refugees.
And you said that about 40% of the 70,000 folks who have applied will get, might make their way here.
The middle.
Now, will that, is that being expedited? Do you know? How quickly might we see some of those folks?
Yes, so the Biden administration has made a decision to expedite the SIV process. The Trump administration almost shut it down completely. So the Biden administration has had to rebuild it almost from scratch. They've added a lot more employees to the SIV program. So I'm beginning to see a lot more movement. Many of the refugees applicants that I'm working with are now getting emails from the SIV office at the State Department. So it looks like the Biden administration is having some success So I would say that we may see next year, 2023, we'll probably see a large number of them come to the US.
And Afghanistan is letting them out?
Yes, so the Taliban do let anyone who has a visa can leave the country unless they're on their most wanted list. But one of the reasons for this is that the Taliban each Taliban has many, many family members. They also want their family members to be able to leave Afghanistan because they know that if they get a good job in a Western country, they will send money back to Afghanistan. So it's, again, one of the ironies of the situation there is that the Taliban also want to benefit from remittances from the US and other Western countries.
Very interesting. And you said that the borders are amorphous at best, certainly permeable. What's keeping people from walking into Pakistan or such? I mean, other than the mountains and so forth, but.
Yeah, so Pakistan is not a welcoming country. So the only real path for the Afghans is to pay bribes at the border to get a visa. And then I learned recently that if they pay a bribe, once they're in Pakistan, that they are able to get a Pakistan ID card, a national identity card, which allows them to work legally in the country. But right now, Pakistan is not granting visas to Afghans for the most part. There's no refugee program as there was back in the 1980s and 90s. So Iran is starting to deport large numbers of Afghans back to Afghanistan. If an Afghan tries to cross into Central Asia, they can be shot by the Russian soldiers who are manning the border of the Central Asian countries. So really, it's very difficult for Afghans to leave by land.
Okay, here's a question, and I hope, Larry, I'm pronouncing your last name right, Romine or Ramine, I'm not sure. But he asked, explain why the Afghan people did not fight the Taliban when the Americans left the country.
Yeah, President Biden gave a very famous speech back in August of 2021, and he said the United States has trained and equipped the Afghan army and police. The government has at its disposal 300,000 professional police officers and soldiers. Was one of the best equipped, most modern armies in the world. The Taliban only have around 70,000 fighters. So it's up to the Afghan people to defend their own country. And the problem, of course, is that the army had not yet been weaned off of dependence on the United States. For example, the Afghan army could not provide food, water, ammunition to the soldiers in the field. Their logistics system was totally dependent on the US. The air cover was provided by the United States. So once the US withdrew its soldiers, the soldiers lost their confidence. So they felt without US logistical support, without US air support, we couldn't win this war. So that was problem number one. The second problem was the leadership. Ashraf Ghani was a very top-down president. And so he kept changing the leadership of the Afghan army. And so he didn't have experienced, loyal commanders in the field. And many of them made individual deals with the Taliban. So they basically many Afghan soldiers have told me they were willing to fight, they wanted to fight, but their commanders told them to lay down their arms because their commanders had made deals with the Taliban. So poor leadership at the very highest levels also explains why the resistance collapsed.
You talked to Mr. Nazari from the National Resistance Front, and then you talked about viable resistance groups. Can you give us an idea of what that picture looks like? Are there other groups? Are they primarily just warlords wanting to grab their own, or are there any angels out there who really have the capability to provide security to the Afghan people to really run a legitimate government? or is it, the lesser of the evils? Who's going to actually be able to provide the most rights and freedoms to the most people in the country, and we're just going to have to live with the corruption that comes with what Afghanistan is. I mean, can you give us an idea of who the players might be that could generate some optimism that somebody might be able to overthrow this repressive regime that really has no intention of ruling, just terrorizing the population, essentially?
Yes, the only viable resistance group is the National Resistance Front. I don't know of any other group. The warlords you mentioned, Larry, they left the country. I worked with many of them. Uzbek warlords, Tajik warlords, Hazara warlords. I worked with many of them, but they, as far as I know, they all fled the country. So the only really viable, or the only group that actually seems to be trying is the National Resistance Front, but they have many, many challenges. They don't have any international support. No country supplies them with weapons or with equipment or with financial support. The country of Tajikistan does provide safe haven for the leaders. The leaders like Ahmad Massoud, he's a Tajik. So it's primarily a Tajik organization at this time. So they have very limited means and no real international support.
Okay. I'm not sure I understand this question, but you perhaps will. Zachariah Matthew says, how could institutions of higher education help their alums secure a visa? Any update on P4 visas? So I'm not sure if he means like alumni of US or international institutions of higher learning, or like your own institution in Kabul. Matthew, do you want, Zachariah, do you want to say something?
Yes. Yes, yeah. This is very specific. I was trying to help one of my alum who was a Fulbright student from Indiana State University. We were able to get him to Pakistan, but he had an interview, but he has not been issued a visa. It is on administrative inquiry. So the question was how any institutions of higher education in the United States could help either the alum or help students secure F1 visa. And recently I read that Biden administration is initiating a P4 visa that's specifically for students. The condition is that the student has to have a full scholarship and the community has to sponsor the student and the family. So there has not been any update for a while now. So I was wondering if there was any update or any conversation on that P4, if that makes sense.
Yes, that's a great question, Zachariah. So basically, what the Biden administration has done is introduced a bill called the Afghanistan Adjustment Act. And this act would make it much easier for Afghans, including students who have been admitted to US universities, to obtain visas. But that bill is tied up in Congress. Many Republican senators oppose it. So I'm not sure what his future is. And excuse me, I was in Pakistan recently, and I helped one of the AUAF students in Pakistan prepare for his student visa interview, his F1 interview at the US Embassy in Islamabad. And he was very well prepared, but he was denied the visa. And he said the consular officer told him, we're not really granting student visas to Afghans. So as you know, one of the requirements for student visa is intent to return. You have to show you intend to return to your home country, because a student visa is a non-immigrant visa. So at this present time, there's not much that Indiana State or Indiana University or Ball State can do to help these Afghans, even though they may have full scholarships from the US institution.
Ken, if I can ask you, because I know you're also a scholar of Canadian issues, Is Canada approaching that differently? I know that one of our participants from last year's program is at the University of Toronto now, and I think he went before this all happened. But how's Canada approaching that? Because their approach to immigration has been a little different from the U.S., particularly with students.
Yes, so as you know, a couple of our AUF colleagues and students are now in Canada. Ajmal Barhanzoy, who participated in last year's program, for example. So Canada does have a much more open attitude toward immigration than the United States does. But what's kind of interesting is that Canada has been very, very cautious in granting visas to Afghans. Even those Afghans who worked for the Canadian government, there's a huge backlog. So Canada is being very, very cautious. I think they're concerned about terrorism. And so also they're afraid that some of these Afghan refugees, may be burdens on the social welfare system in Canada. So I've been, to tell you the truth, Larry, I've been disappointed. I thought the Canadian government would be more generous in granting visas to Afghans.
Interesting. Thank you. Ajmal Palman asked me if I would ask this question to you, and I'll just read here. Dr. Holland, thanks for the great presentation. You mentioned the U.S. has options for dealing with Afghanistan and the Taliban, but hasn't decided on an approach. Why is the U.S. reluctant to choose an option and focuses on humanitarian assistance only? What would be any other viable policy decision and strategy for the U.S. concerning the Taliban and Afghanistan for that matter?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ajmal. So the United States initially, after the withdrawal in August of 2021, had a plan to engage with the Taliban. And there were many meetings with Taliban leadership, and the US put down conditions for that engagement. One of them was education for girls. Another one was inclusion of minorities within the government. And then, of course, also not allowing international terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda to operate within Afghanistan. And what happened is that every condition that the United States laid down for closer collaboration and engagement with the Taliban, every condition was not met by the Taliban government. So once the al-Zawahiri was killed in July in Kabul, the US concluded we cannot trust these people. And so the only engagement we're going to have from now on for the indefinite future is through humanitarian assistance. And you saw how even the money that belongs to the Afghan Central Bank is now being administered by an independent organization in Geneva, Switzerland, completely excluding the Afghan government. So I think for the foreseeable future, there'll be no official engagement because the trust factor has simply disappeared.
Thanks. I know Ajmal's in a public place. Did that answer your question, Ajmal? If you wanted to any more clarification, you can jump in. Otherwise, I'll go on.
This is Dr. Bahrami.
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to make two quick comments, Dr. Holland. I think you did not mention something about the failure of Afghanistan. Pakistan has had double role from the beginning, and the American administration has failed to recognize the double role of Pakistan. Pakistan, from one side, was telling American that they are friends, from other side, they were fighting them. So I think that was, I would say, one of the biggest factor among all other factors what Dr. Holland mentioned about all the differences in the government of Afghanistan themselves, different tribes and different places. That's why people didn't trust. So that was the biggest, one of the biggest thing that I'm thinking. If American government would have engaged Pakistan from the beginning with Afghanistan in regard to some border issue and things like that, so then they could have curtailed the Taliban. No, the Taliban are also destroyed Afghanistan, and also Pakistan would be destroyed the next step as well. So I think that part, I think it has been forgotten.
Thanks. Dr. Holland, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so Dr. Brahmi brings up a very important issue, and that's the role of Pakistan. So when I was working in Afghanistan, it was often said that we cannot defeat the insurgency because the insurgents can always run away and take shelter within Pakistan. And no insurgency has ever been defeated when there's a safe haven country. And we all know that there's evidence that the Inter-Services Intelligence Agency, the ISI in Pakistan, did support and fund the Taliban, especially the Haqqani network. But as Dr. Brahmi pointed out, Pakistan has always played a double role. On the one hand, elements within the armed forces support the Taliban, but on the other hand, the Pakistani government has been a partner to the United States in the global war against terrorism. And even now, when we see that the drone that killed al-Zawahiri in July probably came from Pakistan, that tells us that Pakistan is still a partner with the United States in the fight against terrorism. But yes, there's always this duplicity within Pakistani actions.
This next question is anonymous, but if I don't get it right, if you want to jump in, it just says owner. What is an alternative form of nationhood for Afghanistan that recognizes all of the tribes that now have simply been thrown together?
Well, this is a demand by every country that has tried to address the future of Afghanistan. This is true of Russia, true of China, Pakistan, Iran, the United States, all of them. They've asked the Taliban to include non-Pashtuns in the government and to include women in the government. And so far they have refused. So as long as they refuse to create an inclusive government, then I doubt that they're going to get much international support.
Mm-hmm. Good. Okay, thanks. Well, we're approaching the end of our program, and that's actually, timing is pretty good because I don't see any more questions that have come in. So, Dr. Holland, thank you very much for sharing your experience and insight. I'm not sure of anybody that could have more insight on this issue than you have, and I appreciate your making time at 4 o'clock in the morning, is it? Or now is it about 5 maybe? The sun should be coming up soon. And it should only reach about 115 degrees Fahrenheit in India today, right?
Maybe only 99.
Okay, good. I wanted to close a little bit before turning it over to our president, our new president, Ray Montagno, by noting that the region now called Afghanistan was long noted for its poetic language, even before the 7th century Islamic conquest. There have been many famous poets, the most recognizable in the West being Rumi. The nation also has a number of female poets, though many have remained hidden. I'd like to leave you with a poem written by a young Afghan-American woman named Sajja Allah Ahrar, translated into English and entitled Desire for World Peace. Wishing there is lasting world peace. I wish to see young and old, lips full of smile, wishing to live together as humans, where there's no difference of color, nation, and language, wishing no more children become orphans, where for a piece of bread they suffer illiteracy and hard child labor, wishing sympathy comes to every heart, so humanity is one body and soul. Allah wishes for a renewed land, where war is despised, where there is peace and war is cursed. I desire for a lasting world peace. How apropos. Now, before I turn the program over to our new president, Dr. Ray Montagno, to take us home, I'd like to announce our October program entitled The Cost of Doing Business, Crime and Corruption in the Modern World, featuring Dr. James Long, professor of political science at the University of Washington. Corruption enriches individuals at the expense of the rest of us in society and depriving us of intended benefits. So we should care about this. You'll receive an invitation and description in your mailbox, and the registration for this program will open early next week. So please register as soon as possible, and I will look forward to seeing you all again then. And now, here's our new president, Dr. Ray Montagno. Ray, take it away.
Thank you, Larry. I want to say a shout out to Bibi. We knew each other in Muncie before I moved down here, and so hi, Bibi.
Thank you so much. Good to see all of you.
Yes. So anyhow, thank you all for joining us tonight. This is our kickoff program for the 22-23 season, and I think this was a terrific program. And thank you, Ken, for staying up late or getting up early to join us. I'm going to give a little sales pitch for the organization here. Our mission is to create a forum for increased understanding of important issues in the world. And I think this program tonight was a good start for that. We try to do this through our various programs, and obviously the Distinguished Speaker Series, which is the program tonight, is part of that. We also, coming up in the spring, will have our Great Decisions program, which will be in a more intensive kind of approach to some of the critical issues today. And then, of course, we have our Academic World Quest program for high school students. And we are very successful with that. We had 17 high schools participate last year. One of the winning program for that, Carmel High School, actually went to the national competition and came in 5th in the country. So we did a terrific job with our Academic World Quest, and we're trying to grow that. Those of you who may not live in the greater Indy area, if you can have any influence with your local high school, we're trying to recruit new schools all the time. So if you can make a connection for us and just let us know, we can make the appropriate kind of entree with them. As Larry mentioned, our upcoming programs for the rest of the year, we have the program on corruption coming up in October. In November, we're going to have a program that will address the freedom of the press and the threats that the freedom of the press is experiencing around the world, and especially as it relates to journalists that are trying to be peacemakers in their various countries. So I think that'll be a very interesting program. We are kind of working on our programs for the upcoming year, and so we'll keep you apprised of that. I'm going to give a little sales pitch here now. Obviously, putting programs on like this are not free. We have a couple of ways that you can participate as becoming a member of the organization. If you go to our website, you can click on the Join Now button and become a member of the organization. Another thing you can do is recommend a friend. If you think what we're doing is really good, certainly help us recruit new members and invite people to join us in our programs. If you don't want to become a member, you can just make a contribution. Click Donate Now as a button on our website as well. The other thing is that if you know an organization that might be a willing sponsor, if a company you work for or your organization does support not-for-profit organizations, and you think that Indiana Council on World Affairs might be the kind of organization that your organization would support, let us know. We can kind of make a connection that way. So with that, again, I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. This has been a great program. Ken, thank you so much. And with that, I think we are done for the evening, and thank you and good night.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
God bless you.